Hello my lovelies, hello black sheep, hello chosen ones. On today's episode of our Black Sheep Society podcast, we're going to be discussing generational curses or bloodline curses. So we're going to dig deep and we're going to see, what are those? Do we have any of those? And how in the world do you break those? So hi, if you're new here, my name is Jenna. So we are focusing on sharing knowledge in this podcast. We are focusing on being a cycle breaker and maybe learning from each other's experiences so that we can undo some of these things that could be cycles or generational curses or anything that's holding us back from our true potential and where we need to be. So if you feel like a black sheep, you're in the right place. So on today's topic, we're going to see, what is a generational curse? What is a bloodline curse? Do you have one? And how in the world would you break one? So let's get into it. So what is it? Right? What is that? Have you heard of that before? I feel like most of us have heard of curses or hexes. So a generational curse is a little bit different than like a witch or somebody casting a spell and putting a curse on you. It's kind of like, you know, they have different meanings for different things, but what is it? The idea that negative traits, dysfunctional patterns, or bad luck can be passed down through the generations. So in some families, like I'll use my own as an example, people always used to talk about how broke they were, how poor they were, you know, and we lived that. Poverty was a real thing in our family for many generations. My great-grandparents on my dad's side came from Ireland, right off the boat, as we used to call it. And so they were first-generation immigrants from Ireland, and they struggled immensely once they got here. I have other family that immigrated from places like Spain on my dad's side of the family. So same thing. They had a big battle against how they were going to be successful, and they most of the time came from nothing. Well, so that continued down the generations. Now we get to present day. That's like 4 or 5 generations back for me, and people in my family are still struggling financially. So we haven't broken that curse or bloodline curse just yet, but we're working on it. So I intend to be the first millionaire in my family. Some way, shape, or form, I'm putting it out there in the universe that I'm going to be the one that breaks that curse of poverty in my bloodline. There can be strings of abuse. There can be addiction cycles. There can be any number of things that constitute as a generational or bloodline curse. So you might think of some things that come to mind. Maybe your own family has struggled with things for generations. And so some of those come from the beliefs that we have, way we were raised, right? Our environment. So some beliefs are rooted in things like sin. And so a lot of this tends to come from how we were brought up, right? Maybe you were brought up in a really strict household. Maybe it was super religious, things like that. And so it could be the focus that all of these things come from sin, right? Whether it is or whether it's not. So it could also be seen as rebellion against God or some sort of ancient family trauma. So a lot of times we've heard about these curses in our bloodline, right? We've heard them through the generations. We've heard stories, or we've heard older relatives say, oh, don't do that. So-and-so's got this curse, or this family must be cursed, right? We can't seem to do anything right. We can't seem to get ahead. So I feel like sometimes it's more of a belief than an actual curse. Like if you believe something long enough, maybe it really starts to happen. So others believe that it's a result of sinful behavior that keeps being replayed over and over. So a cycle that's repeating, right? People keep perpetuating the cycle. We keep the cycle going because we haven't learned the tools in order to break that cycle or that curse. So examples of that are the Kennedy family, right? They've had so many of the relatives, especially the male relatives, assassinated. They've had issues with mental illness. They've had issues with infidelity, abuse, things like that. So a slew, right? A ton of different things. So some think that the Kennedy family is actually cursed. I personally don't think they're cursed. In Hinduism, curses of the forefathers are said to cause abnormal behaviors like depression and suicidal tendencies. In Islam, Quran, Sunnah, and Hadith offer insight to break these through manners, ethics, and etiquette. So if you look at like religious or spiritual beliefs, you know, Christianity always says that you've got to do yada, yada, yada for things to go well. Well, maybe you're unable to do some of those things for whatever happened to be. And I feel like sometimes we grow up in a very strict environment that doesn't allow us to really explore how to break some of these curses. So almost like we've been indoctrinated in our own family sometimes of how things should be, how things should go. And if we don't do it exactly to a T down the list, well, then we must be sinning, right? And so, of course, that's why these things have happened, because we broke some sort of rule or covenant or something like that. In reality, the scientific reality is more complex. So some people believe in something called epigenetics, the study of how environmental and behavioral factors affect gene expression. So maybe what you're exposed to, even in the womb, things like that, whether it's abuse or trauma or alcoholism, drugs, things like that, that it can actually change your DNA to actually have you kind of follow in the same patterns or same footsteps. And so while some of that might be true, some of these things are actually reversible and don't change the DNA. So what environmental factors, things in your environment? So maybe you were around a bunch of alcoholics. That also runs in my family on both sides. So maybe because, you know, there's some link to DNA there with cycles repeating, addictions, things like that. Maybe some of those are perpetuated because of a DNA factor. Some of it might be your environment. Maybe that's what you saw 24/7 growing up. So to you, it's a normal thing because that was what played out for you over and over again. Those were the cycles that repeated. There's social factors. They all play a part in how traits are passed down. So sometimes it's your environment, sometimes it's how you were raised, sometimes it's physical things like your DNA, and other times it can definitely be social factors, things that are going on around you. So there could also be some lessons from the past that we need to take away from certain things. I feel like sometimes lessons from childhood can guide you through adulthood. Maybe you want to be the cycle breaker that's not an alcoholic, and maybe you want to be the sober one in your family. Maybe you start to change that pattern so that the cycle breaks and you're no longer repeating that. So looking back at family history can also help you to understand where you are in your own life. Are you on track to repeat another cycle or a generational curse? Or are you the black sheep and you're going to actually break or stop a cycle? A quote that I found for this is, "It's up to us to break the generational curses." And it is. We have free will, so we're here to decide whether we want to go down that dark and bumpy road or whether we choose to go down a path of enlightenment and grow and transform and change things for the better. It's always a choice. So one of my favorite quotes about this is, "When they say that it runs in the family, this is where you tell them, and this is where it runs out." I used that actually in my first book, Stepping Stones to Destiny, because we had a lot of cycles that were repeating in our family, and I didn't want them to continue. I didn't want these cycles of abuse or alcoholism or any of those things to continue on, and so I made it part of my mission in life to help break those cycles. And part of that comes with open and honest communication. Some of it's really painful, right? You pull out the skeletons in the closet or you dredge up memories from the past, and it can be really difficult to honor those feelings and to sit with those and process them. But that's how we start to kind of peel back the layers of the onion and process through all of these things that we want to actually seek help for, or that at a minimum we feel like we don't want to continue and we really desire some change. So some of these end up falling under the category of ancestral sin, right? Maybe it was your ancestors who actually committed the first sin and it perpetuated and continued, or generational sin or fault. It's the doctrine that teaches individuals to inherit the judgment for the sins of their ancestors. So exactly what I was saying in the beginning is some of this is how we grow up, right? So take racism for an example. If you grow up in an area where, let's say, it's predominantly one race and there's minorities there, and maybe they're looked down upon or they're treated like they're less than, or whatever the case happens to be, maybe they feel like they're a target. So that's something that is kind of ingrained in you from a very young age, where something's not right here and you feel like there's a difference. And so we kind of continue that narrative in our mind, or it plays out in our life somehow, that it keeps going. And so that's where we really have to kind of see things for what they are, and we have to kind of make steps to change those things. It's primarily seen in Mediterranean religions that is referenced in the Bible in Exodus 25. So 20 verse 5. So I feel like a lot of the older context, the Old Testament of the Bible, really showcases a lot of how things were very different. Like things were very segregated, they were very separate. People didn't like each other in a lot of different areas of the world. And I feel like that's still actually a thing over there for a lot of it. But in Exodus 20 verse 5, it says, "You shall not bow down to them or worship them, for I am the Lord your God, and I am a jealous God, punishing the children for the sin of the parents to the third and the fourth generations of those who hate me." So I feel like that context right there, a lot of times is people think, well, God is punishing us. And it's so many generations later, well, it's got to be because of what so-and-so did, your great-grandparents or whatever it happens to be. In reality, God doesn't necessarily punish us like that. What happens is they want us to see the error of our ways. And so we have to learn from these examples in order to actually change the narrative, change the game. So here's some examples of generational curses. Unhealthy relationships. Who can you think of that has never had an unhealthy relationship? So I feel like a lot of us deal with things like divorce, fear of commitment. The fear can keep you from actually experiencing love. In my own life, I would say that that was true. I came from a divorced household, and while my grandparents were still married until both of them passed many years later, it was something that I didn't want to repeat in my own life. So I knew I wanted children. I thought about being married, but I always thought, I don't think I actually want to do that because I don't want it to end in divorce. So I did fall in love, I did get married, and it ended in divorce. And sometimes what we think about, we bring about. So we have to be cautious of our thoughts. So I feel like sometimes we actually have like this negative mindset about things, that if we flip the script and we change things and we see it differently, we can actually have a happy ending. But we've got to work through the fears that are holding us back to begin with. Family wealth can be another one, right? Poverty, that whole mindset. So hard-earned wealth from the first generation often won't survive to the third generation. So let's say your grandparents made it rich and they did something that benefited them. By the time it gets to, the grandchildren, that a lot of times it's spent and there's nothing left to show for all of that hard work and all of the things it took to get there. Another one of those is sinful behavior, abusive parents, drinking problems. Children might repeat those cycles. So again, if you grew up in a household that was utter conflict and chaos, abuse, drinking, drugs, all of those things, that might be something that you view as normal, and that might be a cycle that ends up repeating. The curse of inheritance. So heirs who feel entitled to unearned wealth can create jealousy, fear, selfishness that ends up destroying lives. And one of those that comes to mind is the Menendez brothers, that they wanted so badly to spend the fortune that they literally felt like they were entitled to, even though neither of them, to my knowledge, had actually worked for it. The father and the mother had built an empire, they were quite wealthy, and they spoiled their children. But these children grew up to be very spiteful, kind of self-righteous people, and so they ended up murdering their parents in a murder plot and ended up, you know, wasting their entire adult life behind bars for something that didn't need to be that way. And so I feel like there's a lot of that entitlement or false entitlement that really isn't a good fit. All right, Jenna, so enough talk about curses. How in the world do we break these cycles or break these curses? What are some steps that we can take in our own life to hopefully help us to see something differently and to end a cycle or break a curse that's really not what we want to begin with? So number one is you have to recognize the pattern. What is the cycle that's repeating? And sometimes it can be difficult, you know, maybe we have on a set of rose-colored glasses about the situation and we're not seeing things clearly. So take an objective look and kind of see, are there any cycles or patterns that are being repeated? And that is where you want to start, is identifying the problem. The family tree, who also had these struggles. Maybe your great aunt Sally was somebody who really struggled with depression, and maybe that's something that has been plaguing parts of your family for years, right? Well, where did it start? What is the root cause and what triggered that episode of depression? If we can find and identify what the cause or the trigger is, then we have a way to start, and then we can start to unravel or untangle the mess that maybe we are in. Asking questions, other relatives, family members, so that you guys can talk openly and honestly, and learning the family history can also impact somebody and how, if they aren't bound by generational curses. So basically meaning, let's say that your great uncle knew what happened to Aunt Sally, so that you're able to actually figure out, oh, okay, that makes so much more sense. I'll share a story. So my mom in high school was engaged to a guy that she was absolutely head over heels for, and he is not my dad. So she dated this guy in high school, and one night he was walking to the store and was hit and killed in a hit and run accident by a drunk driver. And so that really took a toll on her. And I feel like part of her kind of died at the same time because she really did love this person. So fast forward several years later, she meets my dad, they fall in love, they get married, they have 2 kids, blah, blah, blah. But part of her still really mourned that loss, and she really, many times I'd find her alone crying in her room. She always had a photograph of him, like his senior picture and things like that. So sometimes we don't necessarily know what it is that started this cycle or this pattern. So talking to older relatives who maybe know more than you do can help you to identify and uncover maybe where it all started and how to go forward. So the one all of us are curious about all the time is wealth, right? Like, we all need money to live on. It'd be great if we were all independently wealthy. So what is the cause of lack? Where does that come from? The poverty mindset, the lack, the not being able to achieve any sort of wealth. Well, number one is squandering it or extravagant spending. So that could be something that maybe we had money, right? If the first generation had money and by the third there's nothing left, well, somebody might have blown it frivolously. I don't know why words are so hard today, but they are. There could have been some family feuds. Maybe there were some things like, I don't know why the Hatfields and McCoys come to mind, but there could have been something where there's a big family feud. There could have been major poor management when it came to how we delegate, how we spend money, things like that. And lack of education. Younger generations might not understand the value of money and why it's so important that you invest so that your money continues to grow for you, as opposed to you spend it once and it's completely gone. So the good stuff is, how do we break these lack mindsets or ways to break the wealth curse? Estate planning. So you might not own anything, that's okay, but create a plan to persevere and to distribute wealth. What do you have, and what is your plan to distribute it? Let's say you came into owning, you know, a couple hundred acres of land, and it was really beautiful land, it was fruitful, it was good stuff, and you have, let's say you have an even number of kids, let's say you have 4 kids. And so you would come up with some sort of plan upon the time of your death, put it into a trust that each one of these children gets maybe X amount. Let's say you have 100 acres and 4 kids. Each kid gets 25 acres of land. but it has to maybe stay in the family, right? So they can live on it, they can build on it, but the clause might be it has to stay within the family bloodline. Why? Because you've earned that through hard work, and you want to continue to keep that wealth in your family bloodline, right? So we're starting to see a pattern. Succession planning. Identifying and teach capable successors. So let's say you have a family business. Maybe it's a dry cleaning business. Maybe you own a car wash. Maybe you own a fast food chain, whatever it happens to be. Do you have descendants, whether those are your children or, nieces, nephews, things like that, that are capable, that you could teach how to run that business to continue that legacy and to keep building that actual wealth? Education. Teach younger generations about financial planning. So I came from a very lack mentality. So with my children, I've tried very hard to teach them the value of a hard-earned dollar. Things are really expensive in life anymore, more expensive than they ever have been in my lifetime. And so it doesn't go as far as it used to. But I've tried to teach my children that every time you get paid, you should also pay yourself first, right? You should put maybe 10% of your paycheck into a savings account, into an IRA, something like that, so that your money is working for you. And so growing investments, maybe not getting into a lot of credit card debt, maybe not buying a fancy brand new car just because you can, instead maybe buying something that's used so that you don't acquire a lot of debt. That way, when you get ready to buy a house, hopefully you have not only a nest egg to invest, but you also have learned how to budget and manage money so that you get a really good loan for your home, and that hopefully you're able to actually be able to set yourself up for your future in a really positive way. So a family governance, establishing strong family structures. So maybe we have something set up where if there's land or there's money or there's something that's been acquired, that we set up some sort of structure of how it's going to be ran, what's going to happen in the future. So like a family business. Maybe, the nephew or the son is going to be in charge when grandpa retires. But we have some sort of hierarchy or establishing some sort of structure to make things run in the future. And transparent communication, that one's huge. So promote open communication within the family, right? How do we break cycles? We have to communicate. And the only way to do that is to be open and honest with everything going forward. That way everyone's on the same page. That way nobody feels like they're in the dark about something, and we're able to make effort on breaking these cycles together instead of separate. It goes a long way. So what happens when you break a generational curse? So deciding not to pass down harmful patterns or beliefs, addictions, mental illnesses, abuse, violence, physical ailments. Some of those are preventable and some of those I feel like aren't. If it's, ingrained in the DNA, it's part of your genealogy, it's part of your makeup, then there's probably not a lot that you can do about some of those things. But some of those you actively can. You don't have to take drugs or alcohol. You can definitely make steps to not get involved in that to begin with. Mental illness. You keep your mental health stable by taking good care of you. Self-love, self-care, and if something's off, we seek some sort of professional advice so that we can get to the bottom of it and work through the obstacle instead of run from it and face our fears. Abuse, that can be something that you actively decide you want no part in. That if there was things in the past that happened, you're turning over a new leaf and you're going in a direction that has zero to do with that. And you're making conscious effort every single day to work towards not being in any sort of abuse situation. There could be violence, there could be physical ailments. So all of these things are things to be mindful of if they apply, and to work through those things instead of run from them. And change harmful patterns in life. So if you know something's no good for you, we're gonna actively work at making changes to go in a different direction that's more positive. So God warns us that each generation will be held accountable if they repeat the sins of the previous generation. God doesn't punish children for their parents' sins, but does hold them accountable who don't learn from their parents' mistakes. right? So we want to learn from the mistakes of our previous generations so that we don't repeat those cycles and so that we aren't held accountable for something that we should have learned and learned to change. So some signs of generational curses that we might want to keep in mind. There could be unhealthy relationship patterns, mental health issues, impaired life skills, anxiety, depression, emotional numbness, fear of commitment, lack of self-worth, or depersonalization. Those can all fall under anxiety and depression. Divorce, infidelity, codependency, emotional distance, impaired life skills, difficulty with critical thinking, decision-making and managing time, and perpetuating trauma and pain. Family wealth issues, family patterns, and family patterns that are evil, immoral, or behaviors that don't align with your values. All right, so how do we start breaking some of these cycles? Apologizing, especially to children when you've said or done something that's harmful, can go a long way with repairing communication, helping them to be more open to tell you when something is not right. Listening to children and talking through things with them. Obviously, there's a point where, you're not going to have a long drawn out conversation with a 2-year-old necessarily. So it's got to be age appropriate. But we want to start breaking these cycles early on so that they don't end up impacting people in our lives in the negative. And understanding that children are impressionable and that they will take what you say and teach them out into the world. So think of a child as a sponge, right? Everything they see, hear, and feel is something that's going to impact their development in some way, shape, or form. And you wouldn't want to take an innocent child and impact them with things like violence, right? You wouldn't want like a small child to see somebody brutally murdered in front of them. That would leave a lasting impact that we don't necessarily know what the outcome would be. So we want to start actively working on changing these patterns and behaviors, especially if children are involved. So reach out to family to get a better idea of it. Seek professional help if you're able to. And while breaking the cycles, be kind to yourself. And make sure that you extend forgiveness and grace to you and to your family. It's going to take time, especially if it's a long pattern. It's going to take time. The point is, you want to be actively working on changing it. You don't want to say, oh, I'll do it Monday. Oh, the next time it happens, I'll make the effort. It's got to be done right now. It's got to be something that you actively make effort to change. So let's not forget the power of prayers. That could be something that whether you're spiritual, religious, or even atheist, that praying about some of these things can actually make significant change and impact. So you can ask God to remove them, all of the cycles, all of the curses, things like that, and replace them instead with blessings and to protect your family. Ask for healing and freedom from any sort of negative patterns. Personalize your prayer. Include people's names and specific situations that you want these things to be removed. So for an example, let's say I have an Uncle Joe, and Uncle Joe's an alcoholic, and I'm praying because I want Uncle Joe to get better. I want him to stop drinking. I want anyone else in the family that struggled or being tempted by that to break that cycle, and pray for guidance and signs on how you go about doing that going forward. Another really powerful way is to incorporate scriptures. You can use the Bible or any sort of, spiritual text that you believe in. Not everybody uses the Bible. Sometimes it's other things. Maybe you're Jewish, maybe you're Islamic, whatever it happens to be. Use your preferred method, but use some sort of scripture verses and speak to breaking curses. So in the Bible, in Galatians 3, verse 13, Psalms 103, verse 17 through 18. Those are some that are specifically used to break certain curses. So I would say that whatever happens to work for you, speak it into existence. Your words are very powerful, along with your thoughts are incredibly powerful. So we want to stay in this mindset of we're going to speak positive blessings over our life instead of speaking negativity or curses over our life, and make it routine. So you want to pray regularly. You want to build a strong spiritual foundation. So an example of one of these prayers would be, Father, I ask you in the name of Jesus to remove all inequities in my family and to replace them with blessings. Make it routine. Make that something that you ask for on a regular basis. And try different methods of prayers. So maybe one doesn't feel like it's right for you, try something else. Silent prayers, reflection, written prayers, and group prayers can all be very powerful. So focus on breaking patterns and seeking healing for your family. So that's really how we start to break some of these patterns and things that are cycles that constantly repeat. So you always have a choice. You can continue to pass this down, you can continue to perpetuate a cycle, or with great diligence to end them over your life and your future. Choose healing. Have a great rest of your week.